I remember the room going quiet before anyone spoke. Chairs scraped. Phones lifted. My father's voice stayed calm as he told everyone I was grounded, as if I were still a child who needed correction. I stood there, silent, while 30 relatives watched and nodded. No one asked why. No one checked the facts. He smiled the way authority smiles when it expects obedience. I felt the weight of something wrong, something hidden behind his certainty. Papers had been moved, messages erased, decisions made without me. I understood then that the truth was being managed. They thought I would argue. They thought I would break. I did neither. I listened, and I waited. The silence felt permanent, deliberate, and complete. In our family, nothing happened suddenly. Rules were not announced, they were understood. You learned them by watching who spoke and who stayed quiet. I learned early that quiet people lasted longer. Loud ones were corrected. My father liked order. Not the kind you explained, but the kind you enforced. Meals were at fixed times. Visits were planned weeks in advance. Decisions came from him and moved downward, never sideways. He did not raise his voice often. He did not need to. Silence worked better. When he stopped talking, everyone else adjusted. I trusted him because everyone else did. Trust was collective, inherited. Relatives spoke his name with certainty. They asked his opinion on money, disputes, schedules. When he entered a room, conversations shifted shape around him. I noticed this before I understood it. As a child, it felt like safety. As I grew older, it felt like structure. I mistook structure for care. My role was simple. I followed rules. I did not challenge decisions. I listened more than I spoke. When people described me, they used words like calm, respectful, easy. No one used words like curious or observant, though that was what I was. I watched patterns. I noticed timing. I remembered things other people forgot because they were never asked to remember. At home, respect moved in one direction. My father set expectations. We met them. When we did not, the correction was quiet but absolute. There were no debates. Explanations were unnecessary. Because I said so was not said aloud, but it existed in everything. It lived in how questions were met with pauses. It lived in how eye contact was held a second too long. I did not think of this as control. I thought of it as normal. Other families were loud and chaotic. Ours was calm. Visitors commented on it. Relatives praised my father for keeping things together. I absorbed that praise as fact. If something worked, it did not need to be examined. Trust, for me, was passive. I trusted by not interfering. I trusted by assuming that what I did not understand was still correct. When my father made decisions that affected me, I accepted them. When he spoke on my behalf, I did not interrupt. When he summarized my thoughts for others, I nodded, even when the summary was incomplete. I told myself this was maturity. I told myself silence was strength. In many ways, it was. It kept me out of trouble. It kept attention away from me. Attention in our family was rarely gentle. Family gatherings followed the same rhythm. Elders spoke first. Younger ones listened. Stories were repeated, always from the same angle. Achievements were framed to highlight discipline and obedience. Mistakes were framed as lessons in humility. My father enjoyed these gatherings. He was relaxed in them. Surrounded by agreement, he softened. I watched him closely then. How he answered questions without really answering. How he redirected topics. How people laughed at his pauses. I thought this was confidence. I did not yet have a reason to think otherwise. When disagreements happened, they happened privately. At least, that was the rule. Public unity mattered more than private truth. If someone was corrected, it was done behind closed doors. This rule was repeated often, especially to me. "Family matters stay inside," my father would say. I accepted that as loyalty. My daily routine reflected this structure. I woke early. I completed tasks without being reminded. I reported where I was going and when I would return. These were not requests, they were expectations. I met them easily because I believed they were fair. I never imagined that the same system that rewarded silence could use it against me. At this stage, trust still felt logical. If something went wrong, it would be discussed. If I made a mistake, it would be corrected. Authority, I believed, existed to maintain balance. I did not yet understand how fragile that balance was, or how easily trust could be replaced by narrative. At this point, I still believed that if I stayed quiet, if I stayed reasonable, the truth would naturally hold its place. I did not know that silence only protects you when it is allowed to mean innocence. The first changes were small enough to dismiss. That is what made them effective. My father did not announce new rules. He adjusted tone. Instructions came with less explanation than before. When I asked a question, he answered it, but not fully. There were pauses where there used to be clarity. I told myself he was busy. Everyone else did. Conversations started ending when I entered rooms. Not abruptly, just naturally, as if they had reached their conclusion. Someone would clear their throat. Someone would check their phone. My presence shifted the air without anyone acknowledging it. I noticed, but I did not react. Reacting would have implied suspicion, and I did not yet believe I had a reason. At family gatherings, my father began speaking for me more often. He answered questions directed at me. He summarized my plans, my thoughts, my intentions. The summaries were not wrong, just incomplete. They removed context. They framed me as undecided, unsure, still in need of guidance. Relatives nodded in agreement. No one looked to me for confirmation. I felt something tighten quietly, not anger, not fear, something closer to imbalance. When I tried to add a sentence, my father would finish it for me. When I corrected a detail, he would smile and say I was overthinking. The smile mattered. It made disagreement look unnecessary, even rude. I learned to stop correcting. Rules began to feel selective. Curfews were enforced strictly for me, loosely for others. Explanations shifted depending on who was listening. When I pointed this out once carefully, my father reminded me that fairness was not sameness. He said this calmly, as if stating a principle. I accepted it, though it did not explain the pattern. There were moments when I felt watched, not monitored exactly, but noted. If I came home later than expected, questions followed. Not accusations, just observations. If I spent time alone, it was remarked upon. If I spent time with relatives, my father later repeated parts of the interaction back to me, slightly altered. He was checking alignment. I started paying closer attention to timing, to who spoke first, to who deferred. I noticed that when my father told a story about me, it was always framed as concern. Concern justified control. Concern made boundaries seem protective instead of restrictive. Once during dinner, he mentioned something I had supposedly said earlier that week. I had not said it, I was certain. When I corrected him, he looked surprised, then thoughtful, then mildly amused. He said I must be misremembering. No one else reacted. The conversation moved on. I did not push it. I replayed the week in my head later, searching for the moment he described. It was not there. That should have unsettled me more than it did. Instead, I questioned my certainty. That was easier than questioning his. Small permissions I once had began to require approval. Not refusal, just delay. I would ask, and the answer would come later after consideration. Consideration of what I was not told. Waiting became normal. Waiting implied dependence. When relatives visited without notice, my father was welcoming. When I did the same, he asked for reasons. The difference was subtle but consistent. I was being positioned, though I did not yet understand where. I told myself this was adulthood shifting into something else. That dynamics change, that authority adjusts. These explanations were reasonable. They protected the idea that nothing was wrong. But discomfort has its own language. It does not argue. It accumulates. I felt it in the way my father watched my reactions more than my actions, in the way questions about my plans became more frequent, more specific, in the way my mistakes, when they happened, were discussed longer than necessary, not harshly. Thoroughly. One evening, I overheard my name mentioned from another room. The tone was neutral. The words were careful. I caught only fragments, but they were enough to tell me I was being discussed without me. That had always happened. The difference was that now I was not sure why. When I entered the room, the conversation shifted smoothly. My father looked at me and asked an unrelated question. His timing was precise. No one else seemed uncomfortable. I answered and left. I stood in my room afterward, listening to the house settle. Nothing had happened that I could point to, nothing I could accuse. And yet something had changed shape around me. I stayed quiet. That had always worked before. It was the first time it did not feel sufficient. Once I allowed myself to notice patterns, they stopped hiding. It began with details that refused to align, dates that shifted slightly each time they were mentioned, plans that were described as spontaneous but had clearly been prepared. My father would reference conversations I was supposedly part of, using phrases I would never use. When I listened closely, I could hear the construction underneath his certainty. I started keeping things to myself, not out of secrecy, but out of accuracy. I wanted to know what information existed only in my head and what had already been shaped elsewhere. The difference mattered more than I expected. One afternoon, he told a relative that I had agreed to something I had never been asked about. It was minor, easily corrected. I waited for a pause and said calmly that I had not agreed. My father did not contradict me directly. He said I must have misunderstood the timing. He said we would talk later. The relative smiled and moved on. Later never came. I noticed how often later functioned as a dismissal. It sounded reasonable. It suggested responsibility. But it closed conversations without resolving them. I began to recognize it as a tool. My access to information narrowed. Family schedules were discussed without me present. Decisions were announced after they had already been finalized. When I asked how they had been reached, my father would summarize the reasoning without mentioning who had been involved. The absence became noticeable. I was no longer part of the process, only the outcome. I started observing witnesses instead of arguments. How relatives reacted when my father spoke, who nodded immediately, who hesitated. There were brief expressions, confusion, restraint, doubt, that disappeared as soon as authority reasserted itself. These moments were small, but they were consistent. Records told a different story. I noticed paperwork on the table that contradicted what I had been told about expenses. Messages on shared devices that referenced discussions I had not been included in. None of it was explosive. It suggested intent. The most unsettling part was how calmly it all unfolded. There was no confrontation to anchor my concern, no raised voices, no visible conflict. Everything was polite, controlled, and therefore harder to challenge. I tested reality in small ways. I repeated a detail back incorrectly to see if it would be corrected. It was not. I asked a question whose answer I already knew. The response was vague, evasive. Precision, I realized, was no longer welcome from me. When I spoke less, my father spoke more about me. He filled the silence with interpretation. He framed my quiet as uncertainty, my restraint as confusion. Relatives responded with advice I had not asked for. The narrative was forming without resistance. One evening, I reviewed a message thread that included my name. It referenced a concern about my behavior. The concern was unfamiliar. It described actions I had not taken, motivations I did not have. The language was careful, almost sympathetic. It painted me as unstable, though no one said the word. I closed the thread and did not mention it. Mentioning it would have required explaining how I had seen it. The system was layered. Every layer protected the one beneath it. I realized then that truth was no longer shared. It was managed. My father began asking questions that felt rehearsed, not to understand, but to confirm alignment. If my answer matched what he expected, the conversation ended. If it did not, it extended, looping until it did. I learned to recognize when honesty would prolong the exchange unnecessarily. This was not manipulation in the dramatic sense. It was correction, adjustment, quiet pressure applied over time. I began writing things down, not accusations, just timelines, dates, statements, outcomes. I did not know what I would do with them. I only knew I needed something external to anchor my memory. Trusting my perception alone no longer felt safe. There was a moment, brief and almost invisible, when I understood that I was being positioned as the problem. Not through lies exactly, but through omission. Context removed, doubt introduced, authority affirmed. I did not confront him. Confrontation required leverage I did not have. Instead, I listened more carefully than ever. I watched how systems responded, not how people spoke. Systems were slower to adapt. They revealed strain. By then, the discomfort had become suspicion. Quiet, contained, and unavoidable. I was no longer confused. I was being prepared. The shift became visible the moment I tried to explain myself. I chose my words carefully. I waited for a quiet evening, no visitors, no urgency. I spoke calmly, without accusation. I said I felt excluded from decisions that involved me. I said some things I was being told did not match what I was seeing. I stopped there. I did not name motives. I did not raise my voice. My father listened without interrupting. His face stayed neutral, attentive. When I finished, there was a pause long enough to feel deliberate. Then he sighed softly, as if disappointed rather than challenged. He said I was reading too much into things. He said stress can distort perception. He said I had always been sensitive, and that was not a weakness, but it did require guidance. The words were measured, reasonable. They made my concerns sound like symptoms. I tried again, this time more specific. I mentioned a date that had changed, a conversation I had not been part of. He nodded slowly and said memory is unreliable. He asked if I was sleeping well. He asked if something else was bothering me. The focus shifted without me noticing when it happened. By the end of the conversation, we were no longer discussing decisions. We were discussing me, my tone, my interpretation, my emotional state. The original points were left behind, unresolved and untouched. At the next family gathering, the shift had already spread. An aunt asked if everything was okay with me. Her voice was gentle, concerned. An uncle mentioned that pressure affects people differently. No one accused me of anything. That was the point. Concern does not require proof. My father corrected me publicly for a minor rule I had technically followed. He did it calmly, with a smile. He said it was important to maintain discipline, especially when someone is struggling. Struggling with what he did not say. He did not need to. I stood there, 30 relatives watching, and felt something settle into place. This was not about behavior. This was about framing. When I stayed silent, it was taken as confirmation. When I spoke, it was taken as defensiveness. Either way, the conclusion remained the same. I was grounded that evening. The announcement was made casually, as if it were administrative. My father explained it as temporary corrective. He said it was for my own good. He did not mention what rule I had broken. No one asked. I noticed how quickly agreement formed. Heads nodded. Someone said discipline builds character. Someone else said young people need boundaries. The specifics were irrelevant. The structure mattered more than the facts. I did not argue. Arguing would have played the role already assigned to me. Later, in private, I asked what I had done. My father looked genuinely surprised. He said we had discussed it already. When I said we had not, he said I must have forgotten. He suggested I write things down if my memory was slipping. The suggestion sounded helpful. It was not. From then on, everything I did was filtered through that assumption. If I questioned something, it was framed as agitation. If I withdrew, it was framed as avoidance. There was no neutral ground left. Relatives spoke around me instead of to me. They used my name in the third person while I was present. They offered advice about patience and gratitude. Their tone was calm. That calmness made resistance feel inappropriate. I began to understand how easily authority can redefine reality without lying outright. All it requires is repetition and witnesses willing to trust structure over observation. My father never raised his voice. He never punished me harshly. That restraint was strategic. It made his actions appear proportional, reasonable. It made my discomfort look exaggerated by comparison. I felt the psychological cost of containment. Every sentence I considered saying had to pass through multiple filters. Would it be used against me later? Would it be remembered differently? Would it reinforce the narrative already forming? I spoke less and less. The more I withdrew, the more concerned everyone became. Concern justified more control. Control confirmed concern. The loop closed quietly around me. I realized then that I was no longer being corrected. I was being managed. The grounding was not the punishment. It was the signal, and everyone understood it except me. Truth did not arrive all at once. It leaked. It came through systems that were never meant to speak, only to function. Through records that existed regardless of intention. Through people who were not careful enough to maintain the narrative when they thought I was no longer relevant. The first indication was procedural, a form left on the printer. It listed my name under a category I had never been told about. The language was formal, neutral. It implied decisions already made. Dates were filled in. Signatures were missing, but the structure was complete. I did not confront my father with it. I folded the paper and put it away. Confrontation would have invited explanation. Explanation would have dissolved the clarity the document provided. It was the first external confirmation that my exclusion was deliberate. Soon after, a cousin spoke to me privately, not to warn me but to test me. He asked how I was handling everything. His phrasing assumed knowledge I did not publicly have. When I asked what he meant, he hesitated, then said my father had been under a lot of pressure lately. He did not say why. Pressure, I learned, was a word people used when they did not want to name cause. I began to listen differently, not for content but for omission. Conversations referenced processes, approvals, consultations. I was never named as a participant. My father spoke as if representing me was natural, expected. He used we often. The pronoun blurred accountability. One afternoon, I overheard part of a phone call. My father was discussing me with someone whose tone was professional. The language was careful, conditional. I heard words like assessment and documentation. When the call ended, he noticed me standing there and asked how long I had been listening. His question was calm. His eyes were alert. I said I had just arrived. He accepted the answer immediately, too immediately. There was no follow-up, no correction. That told me enough. The second leak came from a relative I did not expect, an older aunt who had always been quiet. She asked me casually if I had spoken to a lawyer. The question was almost lost in conversation. When I said no, she looked confused, then corrected herself. She said she must have misunderstood. Misunderstandings were accumulating. I started reviewing everything that left a trail. Emails, messages, shared calendars, financial notes that were not meant for me but were visible anyway. None of them accused me directly. None of them named wrongdoing. They all suggested preparation. The narrative being built did not require proof. It required alignment. I was being framed as unstable enough to justify decisions made without my consent. I realized then why my reactions had been monitored so closely. Any visible distress could be repurposed. Calmness, however, created friction. It did not fit the image, so I remained calm. The more evidence I gathered, the less I felt compelled to respond. Exposure did not need my voice. It needed time. One evening, I heard my father explain my grounding to someone over dinner. His version included concerns I had never heard expressed to me. He spoke with confidence. He believed his own framing. Or perhaps belief was unnecessary when witnesses accepted structure over detail. I noticed something else then. He never mentioned my name in writing. In documents, I was referenced indirectly. Depersonalized. That distance protected him. It allowed flexibility. The final confirmation came quietly. A message arrived on a device I had access to but was not expected to check. It referenced an upcoming meeting. The attendees were listed. My father's name was there. So was a lawyer's. Mine was not. The purpose line included my situation. I read it twice, then once more slowly. There it was. Not betrayal as an emotion, but as a process. Planned. Scheduled. Supported by systems designed to look neutral. I understood then why everything had been so restrained. Why no accusations had been made openly. Accusations invite defense. Processes do not. I did nothing with the information. I did not forward the message. I did not print it. I did not confront anyone. I let it exist where it was. Partial exposure is dangerous only when it is rushed. I was not in a hurry. The truth was already moving. I only needed to stay out of its way. Control tightened without announcement. My father did not change his tone. He changed access. Doors that had always been open were now closed. Conversations happened earlier in the day before I was awake or later after I had gone to my room. If I entered a space unexpectedly, the pause was brief but noticeable. Someone would adjust a chair. Someone would lower their voice half a step too late. Rules multiplied. Not new ones, but interpretations. Existing expectations were applied more strictly, more creatively. Time became something I had to account for in detail. Where I was, who I spoke to, how long it lasted. None of this was framed as suspicion. It was framed as care. My phone use was questioned. Not restricted, just monitored through conversation. My father would reference messages I had sent casually as if he had seen them by chance. I did not ask how. I did not need to. Surveillance does not require explanation when authority assumes permission. Relatives checked in more often, not directly. Indirectly. They asked about my mood, my plans, my focus. Their questions mirrored each other too closely to be spontaneous. I answered politely, briefly. Consistency mattered. Any variation could be interpreted as instability. Behind the scenes, things accelerated. Appointments appeared on the calendar that did not involve me. Documents were moved into folders I could no longer access. When I asked about one specific item I had seen earlier, my father said it had been handled already. He did not say how. He did not say by whom. I began to sense urgency in his movements, not panic but calculation. He spoke faster on the phone. He listened more than he talked. When conversations ended, he stayed still for a moment as if rehearsing the next one. Authority, when threatened, does not announce fear. It becomes efficient. The grounding was extended. No reason given, just an update. Temporary had become indefinite without discussion. I acknowledged it with a nod. Compliance made escalation harder to justify, but it did not stop it. It only forced it to change shape. I noticed that my father no longer tried to correct my version of events when I spoke. He avoided them entirely. If I referenced something that contradicted his narrative, he redirected the conversation. Redirection replaced denial. It was cleaner. There were moments when he tested me. He would say something slightly untrue about me and watch my reaction closely. If I corrected it, he would look concerned. If I did not, he would look relieved. I learned which response produced less attention. The system around him responded as designed. Relatives deferred. Professionals remained neutral. Processes moved forward because nothing formally opposed them. Silence in this context was interpreted as agreement. I felt the pressure of being contained, not physically but administratively. My options narrowed. My autonomy was discussed as a variable, not a right. This was escalation without confrontation, and it was effective. One evening, my father sat across from me and spoke carefully about responsibility. He said some situations require difficult decisions. He said families sometimes have to act in someone's best interest, even when that person does not understand. He did not accuse me of anything. He did not need to. I listened without responding. Response would have implied participation in a conversation whose outcome was already decided. He watched my face closely, waiting for something. Anger, confusion, protest. When none came, he looked unsettled. Calm does not cooperate with control. Later, I heard him on the phone again. His voice was lower this time. He referenced timelines. He asked if everything was still on schedule. Schedule was a word that removed emotion from intent. The escalation reached its peak quietly. The lawyer's name began appearing more frequently. Not spoken, but implied. Meetings took place off-site. Documents were prepared. Witnesses were aligned. The machinery of legitimacy moved forward, indifferent to how it would land on me. I felt the psychological cost in my body. Sleep came lightly. Thoughts looped. I had to remind myself not to rehearse explanations. Explanations were no longer useful. Evidence existed without my involvement. The paradox was clear to me then. If I reacted emotionally, I would confirm the concern. If I reacted logically, I would be dismissed as manipulative. The safest position was restraint, so I stayed restrained. Escalation depends on resistance. Without it, it must rely on process alone. Process leaves traces. Traces can be followed. I trusted that. My father believed control was tightening. In reality, it was becoming visible. There is a moment when confusion ends and acceptance begins. It is not dramatic. It does not arrive with clarity or relief. It arrives quietly, like a weight settling into place. I reached that moment alone. I had spent days observing without reacting, letting the escalation pass through me without response. But internally, something shifted. I stopped asking myself whether I was wrong. I stopped replaying conversations to find a better way to phrase something. I stopped imagining explanations that would suddenly make everything reasonable again. The truth, once fully visible, does not demand action. It demands cost. I understood then that my father was not confused. He was not overreacting. He was not misinformed. He was choosing a narrative that preserved his authority at my expense. That understanding did not produce anger. It produced distance. Distance made restraint possible. I thought about what reacting would accomplish. If I confronted him with documents, he would reframe them. If I raised my voice, it would be recorded as instability. If I demanded fairness, it would be described as entitlement. Every available response had already been anticipated and neutralized. That realization was the breaking point, not because it hurt, but because it clarified the limits of the system I was inside. This was not a misunderstanding that could be resolved. It was a structure that required my silence to function. For the first time, I allowed myself to grieve something specific, the belief that being reasonable was enough. That belief had shaped my behavior for years. It had kept me compliant, trusting, contained. Letting it go felt like losing orientation. I watched my father closely during this period, not to catch him, but to understand him. His calmness was not confidence. It was investment. He had committed too much to reverse course now. Admitting error would collapse the authority he relied on. He needed the outcome to justify the process. That was when I stopped hoping for recognition. Restraint became a deliberate choice, not a habit. I chose not to correct inaccuracies when they were spoken. I chose not to defend myself when concern was expressed. I chose not to provide emotional material that could be repurposed. This was not passivity. It was containment. I felt the emotional cost immediately. Silence is not empty. It fills with things you do not say. I carried conversations that never happened. I absorbed judgments without reply. At night, I felt the pressure of unexpressed truth, heavy but stable. There were moments when I wanted to break that silence. When I imagined standing up during a gathering and naming everything clearly. But I could see the outcome. Faces would harden. Authority would close ranks. The system would protect itself. I chose instead to let the system confront reality without my interference. This decision did not feel noble. It felt lonely. It meant accepting that I would not be believed until belief no longer mattered. It meant allowing consequences to arrive on their own timeline. I noticed the effect this had on my father. Without my emotional reactions, his narrative lost contrast. Concern without visible distress looked exaggerated. Control without resistance looked unnecessary. He compensated by explaining more, justifying decisions that no one had questioned. That over-explanation was not for me. It was for witnesses. I began to see the outlines of the ending, though I did not yet know its form. Authority that depends on silence collapses when silence refuses to behave as expected. Mine did not look like guilt. It looked like patience. The breaking point was not when I realized I was being betrayed. It was when I realized I did not need to stop it. I accepted the cost fully then. I accepted that my relationship with my father would not recover. I accepted that some relatives would never revisit their assumptions. I accepted that my name would carry residue even after facts emerged. Acceptance removed urgency. Urgency is what systems exploit. When the invitation arrived for the upcoming family gathering, I did not hesitate. I said I would be there. My father watched me closely when I answered. He expected resistance. He expected withdrawal. My compliance unsettled him more than defiance would have. That was the moment I knew the restraint was working. I was no longer trying to survive the process. I was allowing it to finish. And whatever emerged at the end would stand on its own, without my voice shaping it. The gathering was larger than usual. 30 relatives, maybe more. The house was arranged for visibility, not comfort. Chairs placed in rows. Conversations contained. My father stood near the center, relaxed, practiced. This was familiar ground for him. Witnesses mattered here. I took my place without hesitation. I did not sit close to him. I did not sit far away. Neutral positions matter when attention is measured. The conversation moved through ordinary topics at first. Updates. Small talk. The structure was deliberate. Calm creates credibility. When my father finally addressed me, it was indirect. He spoke about responsibility in general terms, about discipline, about difficult decisions parents must make. He did not name me, but everyone understood. Then he did. He announced that I was still grounded. He framed it as ongoing concern. He used language that sounded protective. He expected agreement. He received it. Nods, murmurs. The system responded as designed. I did not react. That was when the lawyer arrived. There was no dramatic entrance, no raised voice, just a knock, brief and formal. My father paused, visibly confused. He did not expect interruption. Interruptions break rhythm, and rhythm is how authority maintains control. The lawyer introduced himself calmly. He referenced a prior appointment. He said there had been a scheduling misunderstanding. His tone was neutral, professional. He asked to speak briefly with my father. Silence followed. Not tension, adjustment. My father tried to recover the moment. He smiled and gestured for patience. He excused himself, confident enough to assume control would resume afterward. It did not. They spoke in another room, but systems do not stay contained. Documents came out, voices lowered. The conversation took longer than expected. Relatives began shifting in their seats. Quiet speculation replaced certainty. When they returned, something had changed. The lawyer addressed the room, not me. He clarified facts. He referenced records. He explained processes that had already been initiated. He did not accuse. He did not editorialize. He corrected assumptions. My father stood beside him, silent. The grounding was mentioned again, this time as context, not justification. The lawyer explained that certain actions taken against me had been based on incomplete or inaccurate information. He referenced documentation that contradicted the narrative my father had presented. Witnesses matter. So do records. No one spoke. No one interrupted. Authority shifted without announcement. It moved toward the person with verified information, not the person with history. My father attempted to explain. His words were measured, but they lacked structure. Explanation without documentation sounds thin. The lawyer responded calmly, referencing dates, signatures, communications. Each response reduced the space my father had to maneuver. I remained silent throughout, not out of fear. Out of consistency. My silence now aligned with the facts being presented, not against them. Relatives looked between my father and the lawyer. Confusion replaced agreement. Concern redistributed itself. Some faces showed discomfort. Others showed something closer to regret. No one apologized. The grounding was quietly invalidated, not challenged emotionally. Rendered unnecessary by reality. My father's authority did not collapse dramatically. It thinned. It lost coherence. The lawyer concluded by stating next steps. Procedures, reviews, accountability. He did not name consequences. He did not need to. Systems imply outcomes without describing them. When he left, the room stayed quiet. My father did not look at me. He looked smaller, though nothing about his posture had changed. Authority depends on uninterrupted belief. Once broken, it does not return easily. Relatives began to speak again, cautiously. The tone had shifted. Advice was replaced with neutrality. No one knew where to stand. I stood up without comment and left the room. No one stopped me. That was the consequence, not vindication, not triumph, permission. The truth had done its work without my participation. It had arrived through witnesses and records, exactly as systems do when allowed to function. Behind me, authority reorganized itself. I did not wait to see how. I did not return to the room. I went outside and stood in the evening air, listening to the house settle behind me. Voices resumed at a lower volume. Not arguments, adjustments. People recalibrating their understanding of where authority now lived. No one followed me. That felt appropriate. Later, my father passed by without stopping. He did not speak. He did not apologize. Apologies require admission, and admission would have cost him what little structure he still held. Silence was the only position left to him. Relatives avoided my eyes when they left. A few nodded. One said my name quietly, as if testing whether it was safe to use. I acknowledged them and nothing more. Recognition, when it comes late, arrives without warmth. The grounding was never mentioned again. It dissolved into irrelevance, unsupported by the system that had briefly sustained it. The narrative around me changed, but it did not reverse. Doubt leaves residue. I accepted that. In the weeks that followed, processes continued. I was asked for information, not emotionally, but formally. I provided it without commentary. The truth did not require emphasis. My relationship with my father remained intact in structure only. Conversations became functional, polite, empty of assumption. Authority was still claimed, but no longer absolute. That change was subtle but permanent. I learned something specific from this. Power does not need to be confronted to be undone. It only needs to be observed accurately and left alone long enough to expose its own inconsistencies. There was no sense of victory, only clarity. I moved forward without announcement. I made decisions without explanation. No one stopped me. That absence of resistance mattered more than approval. What stayed with me was not the betrayal, but the quiet cost of surviving it. The understanding that restraint is not weakness when it is chosen. That silence, when aligned with truth, becomes difficult to argue against. The house returned to normal, or something like it. I did not. And I did not need to explain why.